The world beneath the waves is one of profound silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of machinery and the steady pings of sonar searching the dark. It is a world of crushing pressure, of recycled air, of men living cheek by jowl in a steel tube suspended between the abyss and the enemy. On the morning of June 19, 1944, aboard the United States submarine USS Cavalla, that silence was about to be shattered by the vision of a ghost. Through the narrow eye of the periscope, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler saw it. A sight so improbable, so audacious, it bordered on the suicidal. There, cleaving through the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea, was not just an enemy warship, but a legend, a titan of the Imperial Japanese Navy, an aircraft carrier of the Shokaku class, one of the two surviving veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack. Its pagoda-like superstructure, its vast flight deck teeming with aircraft, its screen of protective cruisers and destroyers, it was the heart of the enemy fleet, exposed for a fleeting, impossible moment. Inside the Cavalla, the tropical heat was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and nervous tension. Every man was at his station, moving with a drilled, silent efficiency. They were a green crew on their very first war patrol. Their vessel, the Cavalla, was a fresh product of America's industrial might, her paint barely weathered by the salt of the Pacific. And now, this rookie submarine and its untried commander found themselves in the ultimate David and Goliath scenario. They had stumbled into the path of a giant. The target was a mere 1,200 yards away, a stone's throw in naval terms. But between them and their prize prowled a Japanese destroyer, the Urikaze. Its bow pointed almost directly at their position. It was a guard dog, vigilant and lethal. To attack was to invite almost certain annihilation. The moment the torpedoes left their tubes, the Cavalla's position would be revealed, and the sea would boil with depth charges. The hunter would become the hunted, trapped in a steel coffin with nowhere to run. This single moment, frozen in the lens of a periscope, was more than just a tactical decision. It was the focal point of a global conflict, the culmination of years of bloodshed, strategy, and technological evolution. The fate of thousands of men, the outcome of the largest carrier battle in history, and the very direction of the war in the Pacific would pivot on the choice made by one man, staring through a circle of glass at an empire's pride. To understand the immense weight of this moment, we must understand that what we are witnessing is not merely a submarine attacking a ship. We are watching the collision of two doctrines, two empires, and two philosophies of war. This was the moment where the last, desperate gamble of the Japanese Empire met the cold, patient, and utterly lethal reality of American submarine warfare. The story of the USS Cavalla and the sinking of the aircraft carrier Shokaku is not a simple tale of a lucky shot. It is a testament to a brutal, underlying truth of the Pacific War, a truth often overshadowed by the thunderous clashes of battleships and the dramatic dogfights of carrier planes. Our thesis is this: the destruction of the Shokaku was not an isolated event, but the critical first domino in the collapse of Japan's naval power. It was the dramatic result of a superior, multi-layered American strategy that leveraged unseen assets to cripple a formidable enemy before the main battle was even joined. The sinking of this legendary carrier proves that the decisive battles of World War II were not only won by the celebrated titans on the surface, but also by the silent, invisible hunters of the deep. It is a story that reveals how meticulous planning, technological advantage, and the courage of a few men in a submerged steel tube could preordain the outcome of a conflict, shattering a myth and sealing the fate of a nation. This is the autopsy of an empire's last hope, and it begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, a shadow moving undetected beneath the waves. The decision facing Commander Kostler was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of a war that had fundamentally changed. The age of the battleship, the lumbering dreadnought that had dominated naval thought for half a century, was over. This was the age of the aircraft carrier, a floating sovereign airbase capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles of ocean. And no nation had embraced this new reality with more spectacular initial success than the Empire of Japan. The Shokaku, now filling Kostler's periscope, was a living embodiment of that success. She and her sister ship, the Zuikaku, were arguably the finest aircraft carriers in the world at the time of their commissioning. They were fast, well-armed, and carried a powerful air group. They were the sharpened tip of the spear that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had rampaged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, sinking British carriers, humbling Allied navies, and carving out a vast maritime empire. For the first 6 months of the war, the Japanese carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, seemed invincible, an unstoppable force of nature. Shokaku was a celebrity of this force, a war-winning weapon crewed by the best-trained naval aviators on the planet. To the Japanese people and to many terrified Allied sailors, ships like Shokaku were more than just steel. They were symbols of martial prowess and imperial destiny. But that was 1941. This was June 1904. The war had ground on, and the very nature of Japan's perceived invincibility was being tested to its breaking point. The industrial might of the United States, a sleeping giant awakened at Pearl Harbor, was now fully mobilized, producing ships, planes, and submarines at a rate that Japan could not hope to match. The elite, irreplaceable pilots of 1941 were now mostly gone, lost in the attritional battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. They had been replaced by hastily trained recruits, brave but lacking the skill and experience of their predecessors. The myth of the invincible samurai of the sky was fading. And so, as Kostler steadied himself for the attack, he was not just aiming at a ship, he was aiming at a symbol of a past glory that was rapidly becoming a memory. He was aiming at the heart of an enemy who was fighting on fumes, pride, and a desperate hope for one last decisive battle, a battle they called Operation A-Go. And Cavalla, the silent, unseen predator, was about to ensure that this final, glorious battle would be nothing but a slaughter. The order was given. The outer doors of the torpedo tubes opened, flooding with seawater. The moment of truth had arrived. The first domino was about to fall. To truly grasp the significance of the Shokaku's demise, we must first rewind back from the claustrophobic confines of the USS Cavalla and look at the grand strategic chessboard of the Pacific in mid-1944. On this board, two colossal forces were converging, driven by ideologies and necessities that made a cataclysmic clash not just likely, but inevitable. The central piece in this deadly game was a small, unassuming island in the Marianas chain, Saipan. For the United States, Saipan was the key that would unlock the door to Japan itself. Its capture would place American land-based heavy bombers, the formidable B-29 superfortress, within striking range of Tokyo and the industrial heartland of the Japanese home islands. From Saipan, the war would no longer be a distant struggle on remote islands. It would be brought directly to the emperor's doorstep, raining fire upon the factories and cities that sustained Japan's war machine. The American strategy, a relentless bloody campaign of island hopping led by Admirals Nimitz and MacArthur, was a python slowly constricting its prey. With each island taken, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa to Kwajalein, the python tightened its grip, cutting supply lines and moving its air power ever closer to the throat of the empire. Saipan was the final, critical squeeze. For the Empire of Japan, Saipan was the red line. Its loss was strategically unthinkable. It represented the final defensive perimeter, the shield protecting the homeland. To lose Saipan was to lose the war. This stark reality forced the hand of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For months, they had husbanded their remaining strength, rebuilding their carrier forces after the devastating losses at Midway and the Solomon Islands. They were waiting for the perfect moment to commit everything to one final, decisive battle, a concept deeply ingrained in Japanese naval doctrine, the Kantai Kessen. This was the belief that a single climactic clash, like the Battle of Tsushima which annihilated the Russian fleet in 1905, could reverse the course of the war, shatter American morale, and force a negotiated peace. The American invasion of Saipan on June 15, 1944, triggered that moment. The time for waiting was over. Thus, Operation A-Go was born. Commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a shrewd and experienced carrier admiral, it was a plan of breathtaking audacity, designed to leverage Japan's few remaining advantages. Ozawa knew he was outnumbered. The American Fifth Fleet, commanded by the brilliant but cautious Admiral Raymond Spruance, was a naval juggernaut. It possessed 15 aircraft carriers to Ozawa's 9, more and better battleships, and nearly 1,000 carrier aircraft, double the Japanese strength. Moreover, American pilots were now superbly trained and experienced, while their Japanese counterparts were largely novices. To counter this overwhelming material disadvantage, Ozawa's plan was a masterpiece of tactical ingenuity. It relied on two key factors. First, Japanese carrier aircraft, particularly the Zeke fighter, had a slightly longer combat range than their American counterparts. Ozawa planned to locate and strike the American fleet from a distance where Spruance's planes could not retaliate. He would hit them and then land his aircraft on the captured airfields of Guam and Rota to refuel and rearm for a second strike, a shuttle bombing tactic. Second, he would use the hundreds of land-based Japanese aircraft already stationed on those islands as a fixed, unsinkable aircraft carrier, launching them in waves to weaken the American carriers before his own fleet even came within range. It was a plan that, on paper, could level the playing field. It was a gambler's throw, but it was a calculated one. However, this grand strategy was built upon a foundation of crumbling myths and harsh realities. The primary myth was that of Japanese naval aviation's qualitative superiority. While once true by 1944, Severis 44, it was a dangerous fiction. The other, more tangible problem was the antagonist that stalked every ship and plane in Ozawa's fleet, the desperate, crippling shortage of fuel. American submarines had been waging a devastatingly effective campaign against Japan's merchant marine, strangling the flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies. The lifeblood of the empire was being siphoned off, drop by precious drop. Ozawa's fleet was forced to refuel at a remote anchorage in the Philippines called Tawi-Tawi, where they had to use unrefined Borneo crude oil. This bunker fuel was notoriously volatile, filling the ships with noxious, explosive fumes and causing damage to engine boilers. It was a ticking time bomb in the heart of every vessel, a metaphor for the entire Japanese war effort, a powerful machine running on impure fuel, prone to sudden, catastrophic failure. On the American side, the atmosphere was one of confident power, tempered by a healthy respect for their enemy. Admiral Spruance, the victor of Midway, was a commander who did not take unnecessary risks. His primary mission was to protect the invasion forces landing on Saipan. He was acutely aware that the Japanese might try to bypass his carrier fleet and strike the vulnerable troop transports. This defensive mindset would dictate many of his decisions, making him wary of charging headlong after Ozawa, lest he leave the invasion fleet exposed. But Spruance had an ace in the hole, a weapon system whose true impact was only now beginning to be fully realized. The Silent Service, the U.S. Navy's submarine force, under the command of Admiral Charles A. Lockwood and Pearl Harbor, American submarines had evolved from lone wolf commerce raiders into an integral part of fleet operations. They were the eyes and ears of the fleet, a vast intelligence-gathering network spread across the Pacific. Lockwood, a master strategist, anticipated Ozawa's counterattack. He treated the vast Philippine Sea like a personal chessboard. Based on intelligence intercepts and strategic intuition, he drew an imaginary 30-mile square on the map, a patch of ocean he believed Ozawa's fleet would have to cross. At each corner of this square he placed a submarine: USS Albacore, Finback, Bang, and Stingray. They were tripwires, silent sentinels waiting in the dark. And then there was the USS Cavalla. She was not part of this initial, carefully laid trap. She was a newcomer, fresh from the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. A Gato-class submarine, she was the pinnacle of American submarine design. Fast, long-ranged, and armed with 24 deadly Mark 14 torpedoes. Yet, she was an unknown quantity. Her commander, Herman Kossler, and her crew had never seen combat. Their first war patrol had been, until this point, a study in frustration and bizarre misfortune. Departing from Midway on June 4th, their journey west was largely uneventful save for a strange and startling incident. A violent jolt shook the submarine from stern to bow. Moments later, lookouts on the bridge saw a massive whale surface in their wake, thrashing in a pool of what appeared to be blood. They had struck a leviathan of the deep. A check of the propellers and shafts revealed no damage, but it was a disconcerting omen. Their patrol continued. They navigated through a typhoon, the waves crashing over the conning tower, forcing them to submerge for safety. They rendezvoused with another submarine, the USS Pipefish, to conduct a joint search for an enemy convoy, only to find nothing. Later, Cavalla spotted a convoy of tankers but was driven off by a determined destroyer escort before an attack could be set up. For Kossler and his crew, the war was proving to be an elusive, frustrating affair of missed opportunities and strange encounters. They were a weapon waiting for a target, a predator yet to make its first kill. They had no idea that their frustrating patrol was leading them not to a humble convoy, but to the very heart of the Japanese Empire's last great naval offensive. The stage was set, the pieces were moving, and the world held its breath. The greatest carrier battle in history was about to begin, but the first move would not be made by a plane or a battleship. It would be made by a flicker on a radar screen in the dead of night, aboard a rookie submarine that was about to stumble out of obscurity and into the pages of history. History is not always shaped by grand, telegraphed blows, but often by quiet, overlooked moments. A single decision, a faint signal in the noise, a chance encounter in the vast and lonely ocean. For the Battle of the Philippine Sea, that pivotal moment arrived not with the roar of aircraft engines, but as a ghostly green pulse on a radar screen in the dead of night. It was just before 8:00 p.m. on June 17, 1944. The USS Cavalla was patrolling its designated sector, its crew weary from the fruitless chase of the tanker convoy. Commander Kossler's luck was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The SD air search radar, a relatively primitive but vital piece of equipment, picked up a faint contact. A single blip, 30,000 yards away, flickering in and out of existence. It was indistinct, possibly a storm cloud, possibly a ghost in the machine. But it was something. Kossler, a persistent hunter, ordered his submarine to turn towards the contact, pushing his engines to flank speed. Inside the cramped radar room, the operator hunched over his screen, his face illuminated by its eerie glow. As the Cavalla sliced through the dark water, closing the distance, the single blip resolved into something more. First 2 blips, then 3, then 7. This was no storm cloud. Kossler realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he had stumbled upon a massive naval task force moving fast, zigzagging to avoid submarines just like his own. He was staring at the electronic signature of a major fleet action in the making. Raising the periscope into the black, moonless night revealed nothing but the horizon. But the radar and sonar told the real story. The contacts were moving at 19 knots, a speed that screamed military urgency. One of the blips was significantly larger than the others, the unmistakable signature of an aircraft carrier. The rest were cruisers or battleships. This was it. This was the Kido Butai. This was Ozawa's first mobile fleet. Here, Commander Herman J. Kossler faced the defining decision of his career: It was a choice that perfectly illustrates the tension between tactical glory and strategic victory. He was in a position to attack. The carrier, the ultimate prize, was only 15,000 yards away and closing. A successful torpedo run could earn him a Navy Cross and a place in the pantheon of submarine aces. It was the moment every submarine commander dreamed of. But Kostler knew something else. No other American submarine had reported a contact of this magnitude. As far as he knew, Admiral Spruance and the entire Fifth Fleet were blind. They had a general idea that the Japanese were coming, but they didn't know where or how many. To attack now would be to act as a lone wolf. He might sink one ship, but in doing so he would reveal his own position and, more importantly, trigger chaos. The Japanese fleet would scatter, their course and composition remaining a mystery to the American command. The element of surprise would be lost for both sides. Kostler chose the harder path, the path of strategic discipline over personal glory. He made the crucial decision not to attack, but to report. His primary duty was not to sink one ship, but to provide the intelligence that could allow Spruance to sink the entire fleet. This was the first domino. This singular choice, made in the dark heart of the Pacific, shattered the core assumption of Ozawa's brilliantly conceived plan. Operation A-Go depended entirely on surprise, on striking the American fleet before the Americans knew precisely where he was. Kostler's decision to report rendered that impossible. Getting the message out was a life-or-death challenge in itself. To transmit a radio signal, the Cavalla had to be on the surface, exposed and vulnerable. Kostler skillfully shadowed the Japanese task force for over an hour, carefully maneuvering to evade the two trailing destroyers acting as a rear guard. Once clear, he surfaced, and his radio operators began transmitting a detailed contact report: the enemy's position, course, speed, and composition. The message shot into the ether, an invisible arrow aimed at Pearl Harbor and the flagship of the Fifth Fleet. The hunter had become the scout, and in doing so had sealed the fate of its prey. Admiral Spruance now had the information he needed. The hunt was on. But for the Cavalla, the drama was far from over. Having done its duty, it lost contact with the massive fleet. The next day and a half were a tense waiting game. The skies above were now filled with aircraft. At 3:45 a.m. on June 19th, the day the main battle would commence, a low-flying Japanese plane roared directly over the submarine's conning tower, forcing a terrifying crash dive. The enemy was close, all around them. The sea was no longer empty. Then, at 10:39 a.m., fate, or the inexorable geometry of naval warfare, intervened once more. A lookout, peering through the periscope, spotted 4 small planes circling low on the horizon. This was a classic sign of a carrier's combat air patrol protecting its mothership. Moments later, sonar picked up the telltale sound of high-speed screws, the sound of warships. Masts began to appear on the horizon, materializing out of the heat haze. Kostler ordered his crew to battle stations. He had lost the fleet once, but incredibly it seemed he had found it again. Or rather, it had found him. As he cautiously approached, raising the periscope for fleeting glimpses, the breathtaking reality became clear. He wasn't on the flank of the fleet this time. By a 1-in-a-million chance, his patrol track had intersected directly with the path of one of Ozawa's main carrier groups. He had surfaced in the middle of the hornet's nest. Staring through the eyepiece, Kostler, his executive officer, and his gunnery officer confirmed the impossible. There, framed perfectly, was a large aircraft carrier flanked by 2 cruisers and a destroyer. Cross-referencing with recognition manuals, they identified her beyond doubt. It was the Shokaku, the veteran of Pearl Harbor, the pride of the Imperial Navy. And she was recovering aircraft, her flight deck crowded, her movements predictable. She was vulnerable. This was no longer a choice between tactics and strategy. The strategic duty had been done. The report had been sent. Now, fortune had delivered the tactical opportunity of a lifetime. The destroyer Urikazi was still a threat, a coiled viper ready to strike, but the prize was too great to ignore. Kostler had maneuvered into a textbook attack position, a submariner's dream. He raised the periscope only 3 times on his final approach, a ghost closing on its victim. At 11:18 a.m., with the Shokaku a mere 1,100 yards away, Kostler gave the order he had been training his whole career to give. Fire. One after another, a spread of 6 Mark 14 torpedoes leapt from their tubes, propelled by a blast of compressed air. They were set to a depth of 15 feet, aimed to strike the mighty carrier below its armored belt. Even as the last torpedoes were leaving the submarine, Kostler gave the next urgent command. "Take her deep." The Cavalla was already diving, turning hard to port, its crew bracing for the inevitable violent counterattack. The silent hunter had finally bared its teeth. The turning point had become a moment of execution. 50 seconds. For 50 seconds, the only sound inside the USS Cavalla was the hum of the motors and the tense breathing of 80 men. They were diving deep, running silent, awaiting the verdict of their attack. Then it came. Not 1, but 3 distinct, powerful booms rolled through the water, vibrating through the submarine's hull. The magnificent, terrifying sound of torpedoes finding their mark. The crew exchanged grim, triumphant glances. They had hit her. Aboard the Shokaku, those 50 seconds were a lifetime. Lookouts screamed warnings, spotting the white wakes of the torpedoes lancing through the water from the starboard side. On the bridge, her captain frantically ordered the rudder hard over, a desperate, futile attempt to evade. But it was too late. The massive carrier, for all its power, was ponderous. The torpedoes struck home. One hit midship, another near the bow, and a third found its mark between them. 3 crippling blows that shook the 32,000-ton vessel like a colossal hammer. The ship immediately began to list, seawater pouring into her hull through gaping wounds. But the initial damage, while severe, was not considered fatal. The Shokaku was a well-built ship, a veteran who had survived heavy bomb damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Her damage control teams, the unsung heroes of any warship, raced to counter the flooding and contain the damage. The myth of Japanese naval resilience seemed, for a moment, to be holding true. But the torpedoes had done more than just tear holes in the ship's steel skin. They had ruptured aviation fuel lines. The same volatile, unrefined Borneo crude that powered the fleet now became its executioner. Highly flammable vapor began to fill the ship's compartments, seeping through ventilation systems, creating an invisible, explosive atmosphere. The initial fires were contained, a testament to the crew's bravery. But they were fighting a losing battle against physics. The ship was a gigantic, floating bomb, and the fuse had been lit. While the crew of the Shokaku fought for her life, the crew of the Cavalla fought for theirs. The Japanese counterattack was immediate and ferocious. Just 2 minutes after the torpedo impacts, the first depth charges exploded. These were not random drops. They were terrifyingly accurate. One pattern detonated ahead, above, and to the port side. Another crossed their wake. The Cavalla was rocked violently. Light bulbs shattered, and men were thrown from their feet. At 11:44 a.m., the high-speed screws of a destroyer, likely the vengeful Urikazi, passed directly overhead. A deafening roar that filled every compartment of the submarine. The crew held their breath, expecting the final, crushing detonations that would send them to the abyss. But for some reason, no charges were dropped on that pass. For the next 3 hours, the Cavalla endured a relentless sonic assault. Japanese destroyers dropped over 100 depth charges, a sustained barrage designed to crack the submarine's hull through sheer concussive force. Soaked in sweat, in absolute disciplined silence, Commander Kostler skillfully maneuvered his boat, changing depth and course, making his submarine the hardest possible target to kill. This was the other side of submarine warfare. Not the glorious attack, but the terrifying, claustrophobic ordeal of survival. Then, around 1:30 p.m., something strange happened. The Cavalla's sound gear began to pick up loud, unusual underwater noises coming from the direction of the attack. They were not the sharp crack of depth charges, but a deeper, rumbling, breaking up sound. At 2:08 p.m., these noises were punctuated by 4 massive, prolonged explosions that rumbled for several seconds. Kostler noted in his log they were not bombs or depth charges. It was something else, something final. Aboard the Shokaku, the battle was lost. The accumulating aviation gas fumes had found an ignition source. A catastrophic explosion ripped through the forward part of the ship, blowing a massive hole in the flight deck and starting an uncontrollable inferno. This triggered a chain reaction, as stored bombs and torpedoes in the hangars began to cook off. The ship that had launched planes to attack Pearl Harbor was now being torn apart from within by its own deadly ordnance. At 2:10 p.m., and just as the Cavalla's crew registered the final massive explosions, the Shokaku rolled over and plunged beneath the waves, taking 1,272 of her crew with her. The sinking of the Shokaku was a devastating blow. But the true, horrifying ripple effect for Admiral Ozawa was that this was not an isolated disaster. The truth, opposite of the myth of a well-coordinated Japanese fleet, was that his force was being systematically dismantled from below before it could even fight. Earlier that same day, another American submarine that was part of Lockwood's strategic trap, the USS Albacore, had fired a spread of torpedoes at Ozawa's brand-new flagship, the carrier Taiho. Only one torpedo hit, and the damage was initially dismissed as minor. But poor damage control, a shocking and recurring flaw in the Imperial Japanese Navy, allowed gas fumes to spread throughout the ship. Hours later, the Taiho, the largest and most advanced carrier in the Japanese fleet, erupted in a single, cataclysmic explosion and vanished. This was the domino effect in its most brutal form. Within the space of a few hours, Admiral Ozawa had lost his flagship, the Taiho, and his most seasoned veteran carrier, the Shokaku. A third carrier, the Hio, would be sunk by American carrier aircraft later in the battle. Ozawa's meticulously crafted plan was in ruins. He had lost a third of his carrier's strength. His command and control was thrown into chaos as he was forced to transfer his flag, and the morale of his force was shattered, all before his main air groups had seriously engaged the American fleet. The submarine attacks by Cavalla and Albacore were the direct cause of the lopsided aerial slaughter that would follow. A battle so one-sided that American pilots would famously nickname it the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. The Japanese pilots, taking off from their remaining carriers and from the airfields on Guam, flew into a perfectly prepared American defense. They were met by superior aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat, flown by better-trained pilots, and guided by superior radar and fighter direction. It was not a battle. It was an annihilation. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot out of the sky on the first day alone, with minimal American losses. The autopsy is clear. Operation A-Go did not fail because of a lack of courage or a poorly conceived strategy. It failed because its foundations were rotten. It failed because of flawed damage control, volatile fuel, and undertrained pilots. And most decisively, it failed because the unseen hunters of the U.S. submarine force tore the heart out of the Japanese fleet before the main event could begin. The Cavalla's torpedoes did more than sink a ship. They sank a plan. They exposed the myth of Japanese naval competence in 1944 and revealed the truth. The Imperial Japanese Navy was a hollowed-out force, and its final, desperate charge had been stopped dead by an enemy it could not even see. The ripple effect of those 3 torpedo hits would wash over the entire Pacific, hastening the end of the war and the fall of an empire. When the smoke cleared from the Philippine Sea, the scale of the Japanese disaster was undeniable. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air power, once the most feared in the world, was effectively annihilated. It was a blow from which it would never recover. They had lost 3 of their best carriers and over 600 aircraft, the vast majority of their carrier and land-based planes in the region. Most devastatingly, they lost nearly all of the trained pilots they had left. A nation can build new ships and new planes, but it cannot instantly forge experienced combat aviators. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the final, bloody graduation ceremony for an entire generation of Japanese naval pilots, and they had all failed. The legacy of this battle was the end of Japan as an offensive naval power. The USS Cavalla, having survived its brutal trial by fire, played a direct role in witnessing the fruits of its victory. After completing its patrol, it was ordered to Saipan. There, Commander Kostler and his crew had a front-row seat to the brutal marine assault on the island, an invasion made possible by the neutralization of the Japanese fleet. They saw the vast armada of American ships, the smoke rising from the island, and heard the constant thunder of naval gunfire. It was the war made manifest, a direct consequence of the intelligence they had gathered and the torpedoes they had fired. The sinking of the Shokaku had not been an abstract victory on a naval chart. It had a tangible, strategic result, the successful invasion of the Marianas, which in turn sealed the fate of Japan. The fall of Saipan opened the final chapter of the Pacific War. The B-29s began their relentless bombing campaigns, incinerating Japan's cities and crippling its war industry. The noose that the Silent Service had been tightening on Japan's shipping lines was now pulled completely shut. The empire was starved, battered from the air, and its once mighty navy was reduced to a shadow, a force capable of little more than suicidal sorties in the battles to come, like the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The universal lesson of the Cavalla and the Shokaku is a powerful and enduring one, as relevant today as it was in 1944. It is a lesson about asymmetry in warfare. It demonstrates how a smaller, cheaper, and technologically adept force can neutralize a far larger and more powerful opponent by exploiting its critical vulnerabilities. The Shokaku was a symbol of national power, a floating city of steel costing millions of dollars and carrying over 1,600 men. The Cavalla was a relatively small vessel with a crew of 80. Yet, by operating in a domain where the carrier was blind and vulnerable, the depths of the ocean, the submarine could deliver a lethal knockout blow. It teaches us that the most formidable weapon systems are often not brought down by a mirror image of themselves, but by a threat from an unexpected quarter, an enemy that doesn't play by the same rules. This principle echoes through military history and resonates deeply in the modern era. Today's supercarriers are technological marvels, the undisputed queens of the sea, projecting American power across the globe. They are immensely powerful, defended by layers of advanced technology, aircraft, and escort vessels. And yet, the fundamental vulnerability remains. The greatest threat to a modern carrier group is not necessarily another carrier group, but the silent, stealthy attack submarine. Modern nuclear submarines are quieter, faster, and more lethal than the Cavalla ever was, capable of hunting and striking from hundreds of miles away with devastating precision. The story of the Shokaku serves as a timeless cautionary tale for naval planners everywhere. Never underestimate the predator that you cannot see. The threat from below is eternal. Beyond submarines, this lesson extends to all forms of asymmetrical conflict. It can be seen in the use of improvised explosive devices against armored columns, the deployment of cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, or the use of cheap but effective drones against expensive conventional military hardware. The core principle is the same. Find the enemy's Achilles heel, the one point of vulnerability that bypasses their overwhelming strength, and strike it with precision. The USS Cavalla would go on to serve with distinction throughout the rest of the war, sinking other Japanese ships and participating in the formal surrender in Tokyo Bay. But her first patrol would forever remain her most celebrated achievement. The sinking of the Shokaku was more than just another tally mark in the brutal arithmetic of war. It was a story of how a rookie crew in a new submarine, through a combination of persistence, skill, and strategic circumstance, altered the course of history. It is a reminder that behind the grand narratives of admirals and armies, history often pivots on the actions of individuals in crucibles of intense pressure. A commander choosing to report instead of attacking. A sonar man straining to hear the faint sound of propellers. A torpedo man ensuring his weapon runs true. The fall of the mighty Shokaku began with a faint blip on a radar screen and ended with a series of massive explosions felt miles away. It stands as a powerful epitaph for the age of Japanese naval dominance and a lasting monument to the profound, history-shaping power of the silent service, the unseen force that so often determines victory and defeat. Not with a thunderous clash, but with the quiet, deadly efficiency of a predator striking from the dark.